going through that experience with your child, for me, was like someone tearing my chest open. I could physically feel that at times, as if my ribs were being peeled back, and actually everything was being torn. I've been talking a lot in my little love letters that go out once a month. The last almost 2 to 3 months, the same kind of essence has been so deep within me. And that's the essence of grief and death and ending and rebirth, but more so the kind of the grief, but a really healthy expression of grief. And I have come to really know that the more embodied I am as me, the more connected to my voice and my sex and my essence and my calling, my yearning, the more that actually grief is part and parcel of that, because it's a constant death and rebirth. It's a constant sense of letting go and surrendering and allowing that, giving that capacity for things to come as they want to and need to guide me, to show me, to awaken me, to shake me up, to encourage me. And there's so much of that in my life right now. There is so much. And then as I was reflecting on this, I was reflecting that actually the essence of death, of grief, has been with me all my life to some greater or lesser extent. And it's been part of the gifting that I now come to understand as like what makes me me, what makes me more plugged in, what is so like the essence of who I am is interwoven. It's like a dance that dances around my essence all the time, the dance of grief, just reminding me about the fragility of life and the powerful response to that of choose life, choose yourself. It helps me become more brave and bold and more accountable to moving forward, spiraling up all the time. I remember my tattoo talks about this. It keeps me, focused on, gotta go up, even if it's just a tiny bit at a time. Let grief awaken me, not for me to die along with it. I remember my Aunt Liz. She was, when I was at university, she lived not too far from me. I was at Cambridge and she was just above in Peterborough. And I remember going to visit her as much as I could because she was dying of cancer. And I remember washing her at one point because she said that she didn't feel that the person who had come had really done a good job, and she felt like she still had a smell. And I remember it was a very hard thing for her to say to me, to ask me to help her in that way, and I did do it. And I remember her body being quite uncomfortable with it. She knew her need, and her need was greater than her sitting in her discomfort. And I took a lot from that, and I started to see, I'm getting emotional. I started to see that experience as being something around death and what happens to us when we see our death and we can connect to it much more up close. That there's something braver about our choices and our ability to communicate those and meet them. And so I started at that stage to really engage with that. Not long after that, my grandpa died, and I remember going to visit him in the hospital. I came down from university, and I came to Eastbourne Hospital where he was with my sister and my mum, and I loved my grandpa so much. And I remember just being fascinated by the knowledge that this might be the last time I saw him. Well, I knew it would be the last time I saw him alive, in his body in that way. And I remember just being able to sort of step back from the experience, and I could really understand the magnitude of the pain that I felt, almost as like an external thing, and I would allow myself when to feel it and when not to. And that was a very interesting thing for me. At university, I was very much studying human behavior and how we respond to things and how we communicate and choose, choose who we are and how we live our life. And so I was going through quite an experience of self-discovery at the same time. I remember later on, newly qualified, and I was working in Brighton, and one of my patients, I was due to go and see and do an assessment on, a regular assessment to see how she's doing and whether she needed to come back into hospital for treatment. I'd been quite concerned about her, and so I asked to bring the visit early. And as I was getting to her, I had a problem with my car. I can't remember now what it was. I feel like it was a blown tire or something where I actually knew I was going to be late. And so I phoned a colleague and I said, is there any way that you can get there, knowing that this client would be very particularly unsettled if I was late? So yeah, I was late. And my colleague was also late, but we both arrived within minutes of each other to discover that my client had hung herself. Now, I was young. I was newly qualified, really. Probably shouldn't have been doing that job, but they were short-staffed, and I was given a lot of responsibility very young. And I remember that scenario showed me another side to death and to grief that was something that was jarring for me. So far, I mean, I've noted 2 deaths. I had more experiences of death as a child and growing up, but they were the 2 that just came to me now. This client that hung herself showed me the rawness of the human experience that I had never experienced, that I then had this experience with the person that I was with, who had a very, very different reaction to me. So my colleague's reaction was, she was quite cross, quite matter of fact. It was an inconvenience, and there was a lot of judgment over the client and her choices and her life. For me, it was more painful to sit in that moment with my colleague's response to death, to life, to grief, to humanity, than it was to actually have walked in to meet a hanging body of a young woman. But that taught me great things. It taught me what part of my body that connects with. It taught me about the fragility of our mental health. It taught me so much about how I want to live my life and what I want to impact around me. It was really tough at the same time. Death suddenly became quite dark and confusing, and it stayed within my body and the memories of that for a very, very long time. I remember in clinic once we were hosting just our weekly sharing circles, and I remember the time when Princess Diana died. And I remember the circle that time where, first of all, it was really hard to get everyone into circle because people were just in their rooms absolutely consumed with grief and shock. I remember the effort of getting everyone together and encouraging us to see this as a unified experience and something that we could all go through together. I myself was emotional. You couldn't help but be emotional at that time. It was so palpable in the air. And it was this shock, and it was all the layers that came with that, and the story as it was unfolding, and then met with a group of humans who were already in a really vulnerable space. And I remember listening to how people were expressing their shock and their grief and their love. For me, grief is love. Love is grief. for me. So in that moment, I understood that. I understood that this outpouring and such a range, it was all okay. It was all welcomed and it needed to come up and out. And again, I saw more avenues and pathways to the expression of grief, of death, of human response to how we played with that, how some of us couldn't, and it was just packed in and repressed down and held somewhere. The body keeps the score. And that was deeply impactful for me as well. Another death later on that was really impactful for me, and this was very much in a spiritual awakening breath essence, is a friend of mine called Nix. She and I had grown a lovely friendship that in a way was quite private. We used to have a lot of private chats, private moments where we would talk about things that we probably wouldn't talk about if others were there. I met her at church. She was the most beautiful human being, as her family were, and I was very, very touched by this kind of special relationship that we had that was just between me and her. She was dying of breast cancer, and everyone around her and herself, they were believing for a miracle and they were praying for her healing. And I was living up north, running a project that was huge and a big risk in our life, and following my heart, facing my fears. And I was up there and she was down here. And she wrote to me a couple of times when she was unwell and having treatment. In the second letter, she wrote to me about a dream that she had had about Florie, my little girl. And she shared some things in that letter that were like a premonition almost. She took a risk and she was following her knowing inside of herself to share information with me that could have backfired. It could have easily have deeply triggered me in a way that I didn't feel comfortable with, and maybe have projected back on her. But being also in the letter, there was this acknowledgement of her own story and sharing with me things she didn't feel she said she could share with me verbally because it felt too costly. But she shared with me that she had a peace, a deep peace growing inside of her that was contradictory to other things that were going on inside of her. And that she knew that I was going to become very aware of that contradiction. And I really did. I really did become very aware of that contradiction. Ooh, do you know, I'm feeling very much that I want to really just cry and be with that moment that I had with that letter and that friend. So I'm going to stop recording, because although I could stay here and let you witness that, which would be beautiful, I actually want to do this alone, let it all out. And then I'm going to take a break because I have a client coming. I'm going to bring this essence to that client session, but I will come back with part 2 of what I want to share, what's flowing out of me about death and grief and my journey with it. Oh, thank you for that little break. As the geese fly over my head, beautiful. I'm so aware of how many times life doesn't afford me that pause. I take it more often than not. I take the pause. I'll have that, thank you very much. But there are so many situations where I might be driving and it would literally be unsafe for me to utterly let go and surrender to something and give capacity for it, give space for it. There are times maybe in the supermarket that I might actually be sectioned if I just really let go in the supermarket. You know, there are times where it's not the space, and so I just trust it. But the most important thing, and I want to make sure I say this before I go on in case I forget, is that the most important thing is that we do take those moments to pause and to let up and out. And there's so many incredible therapeutic interventions to help support that. But for me, dancing, breath work, having a session with Ailish, going to ecstatic dance, or going to a cuddle workshop, or going to a temple event, or something that just brings things up and allows me to let that out of the body is so important. It's vital. So continuing flowing with my experience of death and grief and where I'm at with that, because it's so close to me at the moment and I feel so soft with that. So moving on really is probably the story you've heard me talk about before, maybe in snippets. And I'm not going to go into deep detail about this because I feel that sometime in the future there's going to be a reason why I want to really go into detail about my own journey, which is where my third daughter, Florie, beautiful human, was born a healthy, beautiful, gorgeous girl, and a week into her life she caught a virus. And she caught that virus in a way that we didn't discover for, we had ideas, but we didn't really discover. For 7 months, we were under investigation. She was flown to a hospital in an emergency, and then she was transferred to another hospital. And we were on a really big journey of praying for her to be healed. Back then, we were Christians, living very much the Christian life. And we had so many people praying with us. But I would be honest with you to say that from very early on in the journey of Florence's, the emergency part of her life. Oh, it's coming again. I would say that I had a knowing. And it reflects back to the letter with Nix, my friend Nix. She had a knowing and she followed it with confidence, even if she was nervous to. And I had a knowing. And I have been able to tune into that knowing more and more and more. And I believe that this knowing comes when we allow everything that's happening around us, through us, before us, behind us, to be felt and to be welcomed. You know, even the most horribly tearing your heart apart moments, allow them to be felt. Now, going through that experience with your child, for me, was like someone tearing my chest open. I could physically feel that at times, as if my ribs were being peeled back and actually everything was being torn. And the knowing that was underneath that as a foundation just allowed me to be okay. Just by my fingernails, you know, hanging on, just okay. What happened after that and the story, it goes, it's got a lot of arms and legs to it. But for now, I just want to share this invitation that I knew I had. I knew I had this invitation. I was at a crossroads. I could go the death route of death. I could die alongside this death and the others that I've experienced. Or I can choose life, and I can choose the invitation for my awakening again and again by going to the right. Now, the right path looked fucking scary. It wasn't going to be easy. And the left part had some, you know, quite a nice, easy road to it to some extent. But the light that I saw through the pinprick right down the tunnel of the right-hand side was so enticing that it called me. And I have always since chosen the right path, and the left is not for me. It's not for me. So I want to just bring this because I am meeting so many people that are dying with death, that are resisting the grief in every season, that don't want to admit to the death all around them because death is dark. But actually, is it? Is it dark? Or is death the brightest light and that's blinding? Could we change the way we respond to the grief to be something radically awakening? Because all of us are in this. There is not one human that won't experience this. So much more I want to say, but I feel like to end it now. If this has stirred anything up for anyone, I am here and available. Book me in and we can talk about this more for your own story. I'm passionate about it, and I'm passionate about changing it from death to life.